They did not move him like a man, they moved him like a threat. 3 horses pulled, 7 dogs surrounded, and at the center stood a man so tall, so powerful in presence, that fear not chains decided how he would be handled. Those who believed themselves masters thought force would be enough. They believed cruelty was control. They believed the story would end the moment they tightened their grip. But some stories don't end where power expects them to. This is a story about fear disguised as authority, about a body that could be restrained but a spirit that could not, and about 10 long hours that quietly changed everything. What began as an act of domination became a test of endurance, and a lesson in how arrogance often creates the very outcome it tries to prevent. The image of a 2.31-meter-tall enslaved man being transported using 3 horses and 7 dogs is not just shocking because of its scale, it is disturbing because of what it reveals about the system that created it. This moment captures the extreme dehumanization of slavery, where a living, thinking, feeling human being was reduced to an object that needed to be moved, restrained, and controlled like dangerous cargo. From the very beginning, the act itself tells a story. Instead of speaking to the man, instead of allowing him to walk, instead of acknowledging his humanity, those in power chose force. Horses were used not for travel, but for dominance. Dogs were not companions, but tools of fear. The message was clear. This man is not seen as a person. He is seen as a problem to be managed. The meaning behind the chains, the enslaved man's extraordinary height too. 31 meters made him physically impossible to ignore. But rather than inspiring respect, his size inspired fear. Slave systems were built on control, and anything that threatened that control, even the body of a man, was treated as a danger. His height symbolized strength, and strength terrified those who relied on cruelty to rule. By using animals to transport him, enslavers sent a powerful psychological message, not only to him, but to everyone watching. They were saying, "This is what happens when you are seen as different. This is how little your humanity matters." The man was stripped of dignity before he was even moved. The horses pulled, the dogs circled, and the man, silent or restrained, became a living display of power imbalance. This was not about transportation. It was about humiliation. The emotional weight of being reduced to an object. Imagine the emotions this man may have carried in that moment. Fear, yes, but also anger, shame, and sorrow. To be treated as cargo means being denied your voice. It means no one asks how you feel, where you hurt, or what you think. You exist only as something to be delivered. Yet within that silence there is often resistance. Resistance does not always mean fighting back physically. Sometimes it means enduring without breaking. Sometimes it means remembering who you are when the world refuses to see it. The man's size, which others feared, may have been the only thing he had left that could not be taken from him. His body stood as quiet proof that he was more than what they called him. Even in chains, his presence challenged the lie that enslaved people were weak or inferior. What this scene reveals about slavery, this single image exposes the truth about slavery more clearly than long explanations ever could. Slavery was not only about forced labor, it was about systematic dehumanization. People were measured by usefulness, controlled by fear, and punished for simply existing outside the expectations of their oppressors. The use of dogs shows how fear was weaponized. Dogs were trained to intimidate, chase, and break the spirit. Horses symbolized power and authority. Together, they formed a moving prison around one man. This tells us something important. The enslavers were afraid. If they truly believed they were superior, they would not have needed such extreme measures. The excessive force reveals insecurity. It reveals that deep down they knew the truth, that enslaved people possessed strength, intelligence, and will. The silence after the image, the title, hints that 10 hours later something changed. Even without knowing the outcome, we understand that time matters. 10 hours is long enough for exhaustion, reflection, and consequence. It suggests that what began as an act of control may not have ended as planned. History often shows us that when cruelty reaches its peak, it creates cracks in its own foundation, whether through resistance, escape, survival, or legacy. The humanity that slavery tried to erase often returned in unexpected ways. The lessons this story leaves behind this story teaches several powerful lessons. Dehumanization is a tool of oppression when people are treated as objects. Cruelty becomes easier. This image reminds us how dangerous it is to deny anyone their humanity. Fear often hides behind power. The overwhelming force used against one man shows that those in control were not confident. They were afraid of losing control. Human dignity can survive even the worst conditions, even when stripped of freedom and respect. The enslaved man's existence itself challenged the system that tried to erase him. History must be remembered honestly. Stories like this are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. They force us to confront the reality of the past instead of softening it. Silence does not mean submission. Endurance, survival, and memory are also forms of resistance. Why this story still matters today, this is not just a story about the past. It is a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked and when people are judged by fear instead of humanity. The image of a man treated as cargo challenges us to ask hard questions about dignity, justice, and how we see others. By remembering stories like this, we honor those who were denied their voice. We learn to recognize cruelty before it becomes normalized, and we commit, in our own time, to seeing every human being as fully human, no matter how different they may appear. That is the lasting power of this story. The use of 3 horses and 7 dogs to control and transport a single enslaved man does not represent confidence or strength. Instead, it exposes something far more revealing: fear. Fear hidden beneath authority, fear disguised as control, fear that the enslavers themselves may not have fully understood, but acted upon with overwhelming force. At first glance, the scene looks like power on display. Animals trained to obey, moving in formation, surrounding one man. Yet when we look closer, the imbalance becomes clear. If this man were truly powerless, such extreme measures would not be necessary. If he were truly less than, as slavery falsely claimed, then one rope, one guard, or simple commands would have been enough. The fact that it took multiple animals, coordination, and time tells a different story. This was not about moving a man. It was about containing a perceived threat, strength that terrified the system. The enslaved man's extraordinary height and physical presence made him stand out in a system built to erase individuality. Slavery depended on predictability, on people being reduced to numbers, roles, and obedience. Anyone who disrupted that image became dangerous. His strength was not just physical. It symbolized the possibility of resistance. To enslavers, a man who looked powerful challenged the lie that enslaved people were naturally weak or dependent. His very existence raised uncomfortable questions. What if he fought back? What if others followed him? What if the system could not fully control him? Fear answered those questions before reason could, and fear chose excess. Animals as instruments of terror, horses and dogs, were not chosen by accident. Horses represented authority, speed, and dominance. Dogs represented pursuit, intimidation, and psychological pressure. Together, they formed a moving wall of control, one designed not only to restrain the man, but to break his spirit. This setup also sent a message to everyone watching. Other enslaved people, nearby workers, and even the enslavers themselves were meant to see that resistance, real or imagined, would be met with overwhelming force. It was a performance of power meant to discourage hope, but performances often reveal more than intended. The scale of force revealed insecurity. The enslavers were not calm, they were tense. They were preparing for a fight that had not yet happened. They were responding not to action, but to potential. The emotional landscape of fear and defiance on one side stood the enslavers, driven by anxiety. Their fear was not loud, but it was heavy. It appeared in tightened control, in planning, in the refusal to trust a single human God. Fear made them rely on animals instead of their own certainty. On the other side stood the enslaved man. We cannot know his exact thoughts, but we can understand the emotional weight of the moment. To be surrounded, restrained, and treated as a danger simply for existing is a profound injustice. There may have been fear, but also anger, dignity, and endurance. Fear can paralyze, but it can also sharpen awareness. The man may have understood something vital in that moment. They were afraid of him. And that realization alone shifts the balance of power, even if nothing is spoken. Control is loud when authority is weak. True authority is quiet. It does not need spectacle. It does not need excessive force. What we see in this scene is control shouting to convince itself that it still holds power. Slavery relied on violence, but it also relied on belief. The belief that it was permanent, unchallenged, and justified. Any crack in that belief had to be sealed immediately. The man's presence was such a crack. By responding with overwhelming force, enslavers revealed their greatest weakness. They knew the system was fragile. They knew that if people recognized their own strength, the illusion would collapse. 10 hours of uncertainty, the title hints at 10 hours later, suggesting that time played a role. Time allows fear to grow or dissolve. It allows plans to fail. It allows endurance to speak louder than aggression. Whether the outcome was resistance, escape, survival, or simply a shift in perception, those 10 hours matter because they show that force does not guarantee control. Fear can drive action, but it cannot predict consequences. History repeatedly shows that systems built on fear eventually face what they fear most. Lessons hidden in the force. This story leaves behind powerful lessons that extend far beyond its setting. Excessive force often reveals insecurity. When power feels threatened, it overreacts. The more force used, the clearer the fear beneath it. Fear cannot create lasting control. Fear may suppress action temporarily, but it cannot erase human will, strength, or identity. Strength is not only physical. The man's presence alone disrupted the system. Sometimes simply existing truthfully is an act of resistance. Oppression depends on illusion. Slavery required people to believe it was natural and unbreakable. Fear exposed that it was neither. History speaks through moments like this. Small scenes often reveal big truths. One man, surrounded by animals, tells us more about slavery than laws or speeches ever could. Why this story still resonates, this story matters today because fear still shapes power. When institutions respond with excess, when difference is treated as danger, when strength is punished instead of understood, we are seeing the same pattern repeat. The image of 3 horses and 7 dogs surrounding one man reminds us to ask a crucial question: who is really afraid here? Often it is not the one being restrained, but the ones doing the restraining, and that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. The image of an enslaved man with an unusual size, 2.31 meters tall, immediately draws attention. His physical presence alone sets him apart in a system designed to erase individuality. But the true power of this story is not found only in his height or strength. It lies in the deeper contrast between physical power and human will, between what can be restrained from the outside and what cannot be broken within. Slavery sought to control bodies. Chains, force, animals, and fear were all tools meant to dominate physical movement. But history repeatedly shows that the human spirit does not obey the same rules as the body. This man's size became more than a physical trait. It became a symbol of resistance, endurance, and the quiet strength that survives even under oppression. A body that could not be ignored in a system where enslaved people were treated as numbers and property. This man's size made him impossible to overlook. His height challenged the image enslavers wanted to maintain, that those they enslaved were small, weak, and dependent. Instead, his presence contradicted that lie every time he stood, walked, or even remained still. To enslavers, his body represented risk. Strength suggested possibility. Possibility suggested loss of control. And loss of control was the greatest fear of all. That is why his physical power was met with extreme measures. Horses and dogs were used not simply to restrain him, but to overpower the idea of strength itself. The goal was not just to move him, it was to send a message: no matter how strong you are, we are stronger. Yet messages delivered through fear often fail to reach their intended target. The limits of physical control, physical power, can be measured. It can be surrounded. It can be restrained. But human will operates differently. It lives in thought, memory, dignity, and identity. It survives in silence, and it often grows strongest when tested. The enslaved man may have been physically contained, but that did not mean he was defeated. Enduring restraint requires a different kind of strength, one that does not rely on muscle, but on meaning. To stand firm internally while being treated as less than human requires courage that cannot be forced or trained away. In that sense, the man's size became symbolic. It was no longer just about how tall he was, but about how much space his spirit occupied, space that fear could not shrink. The emotional conflict within the scene, this moment, holds a powerful emotional tension. On one side is a system driven by fear and control. On the other is a man whose very existence challenges that system. For the enslavers, emotion manifested as anxiety. Their response was excessive because their confidence was fragile. They feared not only what the man might do, but what he represented to others. A strong figure can inspire hope, and hope is dangerous to oppression. For the enslaved man, the emotional experience was likely layered. There may have been fear, but also clarity. When others go to great lengths to restrain you, it reveals something important. They believe you matter. They believe you have power. That realization can become fuel for endurance. Strength redefined slavery, tried to define strength as obedience. It punished physical power and attempted to crush will. But stories like this redefine strength entirely. True strength is not always loud. It does not always fight back in visible ways. Sometimes it survives. Sometimes it remembers. Sometimes it refuses to internalize the lies imposed upon it. The enslaved man's unbreakable spirit may have shown itself through patience, awareness, or simple refusal to collapse emotionally. Even standing upright, literally and figuratively, can be an act of defiance when the world expects submission. The quiet power of presence, one of the most powerful aspects of this story, is that nothing dramatic needs to happen for it to matter. The man does not need to overpower his captors. He does not need to escape in that moment. His presence alone changes the atmosphere. His size forces acknowledgement. His endurance forces recognition. His humanity, though denied by others, continues to exist. This reminds us that resistance is not always an event. Sometimes it is a condition. Lessons carried forward, this story offers lessons that remain deeply relevant. Physical restraint cannot conquer the human spirit. You can control movement, but you cannot command dignity. Difference often frightens systems built on control. When people stand out, oppressive systems respond with fear. Strength takes many forms. Endurance, patience, and self-awareness are as powerful as physical force. Oppression reveals its weakness through excess. The more force it uses, the clearer its insecurity becomes. Human will is resilient even in the harshest conditions. Identity and inner strength can survive. Why this contrast still matters today: the tension between physical power and human will did not end with slavery. It appears whenever institutions attempt to control people through fear, whenever difference is treated as danger, whenever strength is punished instead of understood. This story reminds us that what makes us human cannot be measured, restrained, or transported. It exists beyond physical limits. The man's unusual size made him visible. His unbreakable spirit made him powerful. And that is why this story endures, not because of force, but because of will. The phrase 10 hours that changed everything suggests more than a passage of time. It signals a pause in certainty, a stretch of waiting where control is tested and outcomes begin to shift. In stories of oppression, time often becomes the quiet force that exposes truth. What begins as an act of domination can, given enough hours, turn into something else entirely: resistance, escape, or a reversal of power. At the start, the scene appears settled. A man is restrained, surrounded, and moved with overwhelming force. Those in control believe the situation is resolved, yet time has a way of unsettling confidence. 10 hours is long enough for exhaustion to creep in, for assumptions to weaken, and for human will to surface. The weight of the first hours in the early moments, authority feels firm, plans are followed, roles are clear. Those enforcing control expect obedience, believing that fear will do the rest. They rely on structure, animals, distance, numbers to maintain dominance. But time stretches differently for each side. For the oppressors, the hours bring vigilance. Control must be maintained constantly. Fear does not rest, it demands attention. Every movement is watched. Every silence feels uncertain. The longer the situation continues, the more effort it takes to hold it together. For the enslaved man, time brings something else: awareness, awareness that he is still standing, that he is still himself, that despite restraint, he remains present. Each hour survived becomes a quiet victory. When certainty begins to crack as hours pass, the illusion of absolute control weakens. Fatigue affects judgment, coordination slips, confidence fades, systems built on fear require constant reinforcement, and over time that reinforcement becomes harder to sustain. 10 hours is enough for questions to arise. What if this does not end as planned? What if force is not enough? What if the man endures longer than expected? These questions are dangerous to oppressive systems because they introduce doubt, and doubt is where power begins to shift. Meanwhile, endurance strengthens resolve. The man's continued presence challenges the assumption that resistance must be loud or immediate. Sometimes resistance is simply lasting longer than expected. The power of endurance changes the meaning of events. What began as a display of dominance slowly transforms into a test of will. Each passing hour reframes the story. The man does not need to overpower anyone. He does not need to flee in dramatic fashion. His survival through the 10 hours already alters the balance. It shows that fear did not achieve its ultimate goal, to break the spirit. Endurance communicates something powerful. You can restrain my body, but you cannot decide when I am defeated. This realization often arrives quietly, but its impact is lasting. The moment of change, the title hints that after 10 hours something happens. It may be an escape, an act of resistance, or a shift in authority. But even without knowing the exact event, we understand its meaning. The change does not come from sudden violence or chaos. It comes from accumulated pressure, from time doing what force could not. Plans unravel. Expectations fail. Control proves temporary. Often, reversals of power begin internally. Someone hesitates. Someone misjudges. Someone realizes that the situation is no longer fully under control. And once that realization exists, the outcome is already changing. Emotional turning points. Emotion plays a critical role in these 10 hours. For the oppressors, emotions evolve from confidence to tension. Fear deepens. What was meant to intimidate begins to exhaust. Maintaining dominance becomes work rather than certainty. For the enslaved man, emotions may move in the opposite direction. Initial fear gives way to steadiness. Steadiness becomes resolve. Resolve becomes strength. The longer he endures, the clearer it becomes that his spirit remains intact. This emotional shift is crucial. Power depends as much on belief as on force. When belief weakens on one side and strengthens on the other, outcomes change. Time as a silent ally. Time does not take sides, but it reveals reality. It exposes which forces are sustainable and which are not. Fear burns fast. Control demands constant effort. Human will, when rooted in identity and dignity, can last far longer. These 10 hours demonstrate that oppression is impatient. It wants immediate submission. When submission does not arrive, it struggles. Time becomes a silent ally to those who endure. Lessons hidden in the 10 hours. This story offers lessons that reach beyond its setting. Control is fragile when it relies on fear. Fear requires constant reinforcement. Over time, it weakens those who depend on it. Endurance can be a form of resistance. Surviving, remaining aware, and refusing to break internally can change outcomes. Time reveals truth. What seems powerful at first may not last. What seems powerless may endure. Reversals often begin quietly. Change does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives through patience. Human will outlasts force. Physical dominance has limits. Inner strength does not obey the same rules. Why these 10 hours matter? These 10 hours matter because they remind us that history often turns in moments of waiting. Not every change begins with action. Some begin with refusal to collapse. The story suggests that something unexpected followed, because time allowed reality to surface. The system that believed itself unchallenged encountered a force it could not fully command. Human endurance. That is why the hours matter. They mark the space where fear lost certainty and will found its footing. The lasting meaning, 10 hours that changed everything, is not just about what happened at the end. It is about what happened during the slow, steady shift from imposed control to uncertain authority. It reminds us that power is not only about who acts, but about who lasts, and sometimes lasting is enough to change everything. At the heart of this story lies a timeless truth. Arrogance blinds judgment, and cruelty invites consequences. The actions of the oppressors, marked by overconfidence and excessive force, suggest a belief that power is permanent and resistance impossible. Yet history repeatedly teaches the opposite. When authority is fueled by cruelty rather than wisdom, it often plants the seeds of outcomes it never expected. From the beginning, the oppressors believe they are in complete control. Their decisions are not careful or measured, they are theatrical. The use of overwhelming force is not simply practical, it is symbolic. It says, "We decide your value, we decide your fate." This is arrogance at work, the belief that dominance needs no restraint, no humility, no foresight. But arrogance has a weakness. It assumes the future will behave exactly as the past has. Cruelty as a miscalculation, cruelty is often mistaken for strength. In this story, it appears as excessive measures meant to intimidate and silence. The oppressors believe that fear will solve everything quickly. They expect submission. They expect the display to end the matter. What they fail to consider is how cruelty sharpens awareness. When a person is pushed to the edge, they see more clearly. They listen more carefully. They learn where power relies on habit rather than certainty. Cruelty also reveals intent. It tells the oppressed exactly how little mercy they can expect, and in doing so, it removes any illusion that cooperation will lead to safety. Once that illusion is gone, the rules change. The oppressors believe their actions will discourage resistance. Instead, they remove the last reason not to resist. Overconfidence and the illusion of control over confidence appears in the certainty that nothing can go wrong. Plans are made with the assumption that force guarantees obedience. There is no backup plan for endurance, no consideration for time, no recognition that human will can adapt. This overconfidence is visible in how the situation is managed. Everything is external: numbers, animals, distance. There is no understanding of the inner world of the person being controlled. That inner world is dismissed as irrelevant. But what is ignored becomes powerful. As time passes, cracks appear. Maintaining dominance requires energy, coordination, and constant attention. Arrogance did not plan for fatigue. Cruelty did not plan for patience. Overconfidence did not plan for resilience. And so the balance begins to shift. The emotional shift no one expected. Emotion is the hidden current of this story. At first, the oppressors feel assured. Their confidence is loud. Their authority feels unquestioned. But as the hours pass, that confidence changes. It tightens. Vigilance replaces ease. Fear, previously projected outward, turns inward. Questions arise where certainty once stood. For the oppressed man, the emotional journey moves in the opposite direction. Initial fear gives way to clarity. Clarity becomes steadiness. Steadiness becomes strength. This emotional reversal is crucial. Power depends not only on force, but on belief. When belief weakens on one side and strengthens on the other, consequences follow. When arrogance meets reality, the story implies an outcome the oppressors never imagined. That outcome does not need to be dramatic to be decisive. Sometimes the greatest consequence is the collapse of assumed superiority. Arrogance assumes predictability. Reality rarely complies. The oppressors expected fear to end the situation quickly. Instead, time exposed their misjudgment. Their cruelty did not break the spirit they sought to control. Their overconfidence prevented them from recognizing danger until it was already present. In that moment, the lesson becomes clear. Power that refuses to reflect will eventually be corrected by reality. Consequences are not always immediate, but they are certain. One of the most important ideas in this story is that consequences may be delayed, but they are not avoided. Cruelty creates tension. Overconfidence creates blind spots. Together, they form conditions for unexpected outcomes. The oppressors likely believed they were making an example. Instead, they became one. Their actions demonstrated that dominance without understanding is fragile. That authority without humility is temporary. That systems built on fear must constantly prove themselves and eventually fail. Lessons that reach beyond the story. This story offers lessons that remain relevant in every era. Arrogance weakens judgment. When people believe they cannot be challenged, they stop paying attention to reality. Cruelty removes moral authority. Once compassion is abandoned, obedience becomes unstable and temporary. Force cannot replace understanding. Control achieved without insight is always at risk of collapse. Consequences grow in silence. Not every result is immediate. Some form slowly until they can no longer be ignored. Underestimating others is the greatest mistake. Dismissing human will is how power miscalculates its own limits. Why? This lesson still matters. This is not just a historical lesson. It is a human one. Whenever authority becomes arrogant, whenever power relies on cruelty, whenever confidence replaces reflection, the same pattern emerges. The story reminds us that dominance is not destiny, that strength without humility invites reversal, and that the consequences of cruelty often arrive in forms the cruel never predicted. In the end, the greatest failure of the oppressors was not their force. It was their belief that force was enough. That belief has undone many before them, and it always will. In the end, what remained was not the sound of dogs or the strain of horses, but the truth that force could not erase. They had tried to move a man as if he were an object, surrounding him, restraining him, overwhelming him with numbers and fear. They believed his size made him dangerous, and their cruelty made them safe. For hours they held their control tightly, convinced that power meant domination and obedience would follow. Yet with every passing moment, that certainty weakened. 10 hours changed everything. What they did not anticipate was endurance. They did not expect a human will strong enough to outlast fear, nor a presence that refused to shrink under humiliation. The man did not need to overpower anyone to prove his strength. By surviving, by remaining unbroken, he exposed the weakness beneath their arrogance. Their force revealed their fear. Their cruelty revealed their blindness. This story is not only about one man and one moment. It is about a system that believed itself untouchable and discovered it was not. It reminds us that oppression depends on illusion, and that illusion collapses when faced with patience, dignity, and inner resolve. The lasting lesson is clear. Power that relies on cruelty will always misjudge the human spirit. Bodies can be restrained, but courage endures. Control can be displayed, but it cannot command respect. And sometimes the greatest resistance is not in what is done, but in what refuses to be broken. That is why this story matters. It does not end in noise or spectacle. It ends in truth, quiet, undeniable, and stronger than force.